Right now, as our democracies are under major pressure around the world, both by internal and external factors, it seems like we can't stop talking about our democracies. Yet, despite all the noise, it often feels like we're not talking about the same thing. Democracy may be a familiar word, but as a concept it's frequently misunderstood and misused, as we live in an age where dictatorships adopt the language of democracy to claim legitimacy, from holding fake elections to obvious fake names, such as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or the Democratic Republic of Congo. Meanwhile, within democratic nations, reactions to events like the elections of figures such as Donald Trump or Lula da Silva show how divided we are about what democracy should look like. For some, these moments represent triumphs of popular will. For others, they symbolize democratic decline. The truth is, when we talk about democracy, we're often speaking past each other, using the same word but with vastly different understandings. And in this video, I want to cut through the noise and define what democracy truly is. By defining its institutions and the role of citizens and political leaders in democracies, I hope to show not only why democracy matters, but also why it's worth defending, even in the face of today's uncertainty. And to first understand why we should care about democracy, we need to know what democracy actually is. Democracy stems from ancient Greece, where the word democracy derived from the Greek words demos, which meant people, and krateo, what means rule or govern. Literally translated, it means rule by the people. And in the dictionary definition, democracy is government by the people in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised directly by them or by their elected agent under a free electoral system. So in the purest form, the goal of democracy is to pursue the common good by giving people influence and control over their own government. And here we have to differentiate between two purposes in democracy. One is instrumental, where democracy is only a method for processing whatever conflict may arise in society, as it gives the people influence and control over their own government. A well-functioning government allows people to speak and govern themselves, but also adjust or correct themselves. Democratic self-correction is an important value where people can reverse incorrect decisions, learn or recognize that no decision could be the final decision. However, democracy can also be understood as an embodiment of values and ideals that different groups of people want democracy to realize. In this way, democracy doesn't only become about the means, but it's also the goal itself. And the democracy can fall into two basic categories: a direct or representative democracy. In a direct democracy, all citizens, without the middlemen of elected or appointed officials, can participate in making public decisions. This is also how famously the ancient democracies functioned, like ancient Greece, which had a very complex system of sortition and deliberation to talk and make decisions and govern together. And in a future video, we'll further look in how this form actually functioned. But all modern democracies, with its size and complexity, function like a representative democracy, where citizens elect officials to make political decisions, formulate laws and administer the programs for the public good. In the name of the people, such officials can deliberate on complex public issues in a thoughtful and systemic way that requires an investment of time and energy that is often not possible for the vast majority of private citizens. And within the category of representative democracy, there are many ways that democracy can be done, such as presidential, parliamentary, semi-presidential, and much more. However, this is also all for a future video. A well-functioning representative democracy contains different aspects. Most importantly, democracies need to have sovereignty for the people. We need states to coordinate how the millions of us work together, but we also want our freedom as human beings. And that's also why democracy can be understood as the institutionalization of freedom. Most contemporary democracies have institutions that protect the rights and freedoms of all citizens. And these include freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of privacy, and freedom of assembly, to name only a few. Furthermore, government is based upon consent of the governed. And this creates a system where citizens freely make political decisions by majority rule. However, we also need to make sure that democracy has some constraints, as rule by majority is not necessarily democratic. No system would be faithful if it permitted that 51% of the population oppressed the remaining 49% in the name of the majority. So in a democratic society, majority rule must be coupled with the guarantees of individual human rights that serve to protect the right of minorities, whether they are ethnic, religious, or political, or simply the losers in the debate over a piece of controversial legislation. And this form of government is a constitutional democracy. In such a society, the majority rules and the rights of minorities are protected by law and through the institutionalization of law. The rule of law is the idea that people are governed primarily by a clear set of laws, created by elected representatives and equally applying to everyone. And respect for the rule of law and an independent judiciary is there to uphold its core features of democracy. In an ideal democratic system, no one is above the law and no one can be excluded from the protection of the law. And this gets made sure by the right of equality of the law, which is fundamental for any just democratic society. Whether you are rich or poor, or a minority or a majority, all are entitled to equal protection before the law. Furthermore, the law needs to have a due process, as every state must have the power to maintain order and punish criminal acts, but the rules and procedures by which the state enforce its law must be public and explicit, and not secret, arbitrary, or subject to political manipulation by the state. And the base of any democratic society is often the Constitution, which is the formal agreement of fundamental obligations, procedures, and institutions. At the minimum, the Constitution should establish the authority of the national government, provide guarantees for fundamental human rights, and set forth the government's basic operating procedures. And how we elect our politicians is central in our democracies, because in a democracy, the authority of the government comes solely from the consent of the citizens. Democratic elections need to have equal access to vote, open competition among parties and candidates, and everyone needs to adhere to the results of the free and fair elections, also through a peaceful transfer of power. Ideally, parties understand that elections demonstrate the will of the people. And because of this, you somehow need to have a loyal opposition, as it means that every side at least values free and fair elections. And although elections are not perfect, it is the way of forming a government that best enables people to live freely and with dignity, and to create the strongest incentive for leaders to serve people's interests. And ideally, power must be divided among distinct branches of government, as outlined by Montesquieu's concept of trias politica, where you have first the legislative power to make laws, second the executive power to implement laws, and third the judicial power to check laws to see if their implementation is correct. And this separation of powers prevents the concentration of authority and ensures that each branch serves as a check of the others. And this is the typical dry information that you would normally get in a social science class. However, you are not stupid. If democracy is so great on paper, why does it seem to be struggling in practice? Across the world, we're witnessing widespread examples of democratic decline, often driven by leaders who disregard democratic norms and institutions, as well as voters who allow them to get away with it. Democratic backsliding often begins with leaders who refuse to play by the rules, and here are some of the most common ways they do this. Some leaders can't accept losing power and instead undermine free elections. Donald Trump's refusal to concede the 2020 US election and Jair Bolsonaro's attempt to discredit Brazil's election results are clear examples. And in Venezuela, Maduro went even further, rigging elections and suppressing opposition to hold onto power. And in other countries, we can see leaders attack judicial powers and trying to use it for their own political good. In Hungary and Poland, leaders have systematically weakened judicial independence, blurring the lines between politicians and judges. By controlling the courts, they ensure decisions align with their interests, even when those decisions erode democratic values. And some leaders try to evade the rule of law entirely. In Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu has faced significant backlash for attempting judicial reforms that critics argue would place him above the law while he faces corruption charges. But leaders aren't the only problem. Democracies can also decline when citizens stop holding their leaders accountable. In many cases, voters continue to support politicians who erode democratic norms. When voters prioritize short-term benefits, such as economic relief or cultural alignment, over long-term democratic stability, they can empower leaders who erode democratic institutions. And this reflects something. While we often define democracy solely from our current representative democracies and from its institutions such as elections, governments, and legal frameworks, it's much more than that. A healthy democracy is not just about what leaders do, it's about what we, as citizens, build together. Democracy thrives when it's rooted in a vibrant civil society that fosters participation, education, compromise, and pluralism. In a democracy, government is just one part of a larger civil society that includes associations, organizations, political parties, and other groups. This diversity of institutions, known as pluralism, is essential for democracy because it creates multiple channels for legitimacy and influence outside of government itself. And pluralism allows citizens to engage in democracy in various ways, through voting and participation in elections, by raising their voice through protest or activism, by joining political parties, interest groups, or associations that reflect their values, or by consuming and supporting independent media, which holds governments accountable. And these avenues ensure that people can pursue their interests, influence policy, and hold leaders accountable in ways that extend far beyond the ballot box. And while citizens in a free society enjoy the ability to make personal decisions, such as where to live, what to read, what to believe, where to work, this freedom comes with responsibility. Remember that democracy is the institutionalization of freedom, and it requires active engagement and certain civic competences from both citizens and its leaders. For a democracy to thrive, its citizens need civic education through schools and other institutions which teach values like active citizenship and support for democratic processes. And citizens need to have a certain level of respect for diverse perspectives and the ability to build consensus and compromise within groups. And in an age of misinformation, understanding how to critically evaluate sources of information is crucial. And citizens also need to understand how public deliberation and decision-making works, so they can recognize that democratic strength lies in its embracing diversity and complexity. So, as told in my previous video, democracy can't be easy. It demands effort, patience, and a commitment to navigate the challenges of collective decision-making. But ultimately, democracy is not only its institutions and it isn't static, it's an ongoing project. The democracies we live in represent amazing achievements, but they are far from the endpoint, as democracy requires constant maintenance and care. And around the world, grassroots movements remind us of this. In Hong Kong, Belarus, Chile, and Ukraine, ordinary people have stood up to protect democratic values even when they were under threat. But how can democracies confront these anti-democratic threats, even when they arise from leaders or voters? The answer lies in two approaches: protection from the top down through strong institutions and leadership, and defense from the bottom through active civil society and engaged citizens. Political leaders and elites must recognize that democracy is fragile. History shows that democratic systems are vulnerable. They require active defense. This concept, often referred to as the militant democracy, involves democracies adopting measures to protect themselves from internal threats, while upholding core democratic principles. Leaders must put aside their political differences to agree on the fundamental norms of democracy. They must commit to peaceful transfer of power, judicial independence, and freedom of speech, even when it means restraining their own power. And democracies need rules to deal with autocratic challenges. For instance, party or leaders openly working against democratic norms may need to be restricted. However, these restrictions must be carefully balanced to avoid infringing on free speech. One example is the Belgian term the cordon sanitaire, a strategy where anti-democratic parties are allowed to run in elections but are excluded from coalitions and governing power. This approach maintains pluralism while also limiting the influence of these harmful actors. However, democracy cannot survive without the active participation of its citizens. Defending democracy is not just about opposing autocratic leaders. It requires a positive vision for the future, one that inspires trust and engagement. Citizens and organizations must demonstrate why democracy matters. and this involves fostering inclusive participation and meaningful deliberation and a willingness to listen to diverse perspectives. And democracy depends on informed citizens. Schools, media, and civil society must remind people of the principles of democracy and the danger of authoritarianism. Voters need to understand that supporting an autocratic leader out of frustration or a certain sentiment is a luxury that can lead to long-term consequences. And civil society should work to reform and strengthen democratic institutions by addressing issues like inequality, corruption, or inefficiency. Grassroots movements can rebuild trust in democracy and show that it can work effectively at local, national, and international level. But defending democracy is not an easy task. Building consensus on democratic values is difficult, especially when opposition groups have conflicting priorities. A common enemy, like an autocratic leader, can temporarily unite opposition movements, but long-term unity requires shared principles and goals. In our current Western democracies, this is a real challenge through the dangerous mix of anti-elite and anti-immigrant attitudes coupled with a very minimal view of democracy, that it is primarily an expression of the popular will. When parties prioritize these agendas over the protection of democratic norms, democratic decline becomes a real possibility. However, all this doesn't mean that we should lose sight on why democracy is so important and why it's worth it on the long term. Nobel Prize winner economist Amartya Sen famously argued that there are no famines in functioning democracies because you can't get away with having one. And scientists have proven that it is true in at least 7 cases. First, democracy leads to a better well-being. People in stable democracies are often much more satisfied with their lives than those in less democratic countries. People are especially happy in parliamentary and proportional representation electoral systems, as they perhaps best represent diverse interests and views. And democracies also lead to better health and lower infant mortality rates, as democracies are better able to build up a bureaucracy and distribute healthcare towards its citizens. And democracy also leads to more human and civil rights, because religious, racial, political, and sexual minorities are able to band and group together, both politically and in society, for their own self-protection. Furthermore, democracy also have shown to lead to stronger relationships and more social capital through strong civil society and a local democracy. Democracies also tend to be more peaceful, as they are less able to drive resources towards the military, but it's also more difficult for leaders to initiate wars, as they are up for re-election every few years. Democracies are also less likely to experience civil war, domestic terrorism, and military coups. Democracies also enjoy more stable economic growth, and their economies are often more equal. This is because democracies often tend to build some sort of safety net, so citizens have autonomy and rights to pursue their own lives. Lastly, democracies also tend to get better governance. Countries which are authoritarian or even still transitioning to democracies tend to be way more vulnerable to bribery and nepotism. A solid administration and high trust can lead to lower corruption and better governance. And this is why we should care about democracy. While democracy often appears to be defined by its institutions and political elites, it is far more than just systems and structures. Democracy is a living project, created and sustained by the active participation of its citizens and leaders alike. It's easy to become complacent, especially when democracies feel stable or secure. But that can take us to take democratic freedoms for granted, or even to flirt with authoritarian leadership. Democracy is far more fragile than it seems, and it requires constant attention and care. Defending democracy means more than just resisting threats. It means strengthening institutions, upholding democratic norms, and fostering a culture that rejects authoritarianism. It is a shared responsibility, and one that demands action from all of us every day.